Boy, they really didn't want you to see this video. Now, in this Katie Snapchat picture, I've been saying that there was somebody in the background here wearing red shorts. So I pumped up the exposure, and as you can see, it certainly looks like it.
TikTok investigator uncovers bombshell evidence in the Nolan Wells case. That's what's spreading right now, across every platform you can think of. But here's what that title is actually hinting at. Somebody sat down for weeks, not days, weeks, and went through hours of footage, frame by frame. Footage almost nobody else looked at twice. She zoomed in on bracelets, on hairlines, on body types. She says she can tell you exactly who was on that boat, exactly where they were standing. So take a look at this for a moment, because bombshell is a big word. And by the end of this video, you're going to decide for yourself if it actually earns it. Okay, stay with me, because this is where it gets interesting. Let's go back to the beginning first. 10 miles off the Mississippi coast, reachable only by boat, there's a barrier island, Horn Island. Every single 4th of July, it becomes one of the most crowded places on the entire Gulf Coast. Hundreds of people gathering along the shore, a lot of them friends since high school, back together for a holiday that's part reunion, part tradition. On July 4th, right in the middle of all that, was an 18-year-old, wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College, out on the water with friends he'd known since high school. He was last seen wearing blue swim trunks, sunglasses. He never made it home. 2 days later, a park ranger found his body in the water, near the island's northwestern shore. And what happened in the hours in between is still, officially, unknown. Now watch this, because that gap, that unknown stretch of time, is exactly where this TikTok investigator picked up the story. She started asking a question a lot of people already assumed had been settled. Was everyone who came home actually where they said they were? Now, before we go any further, I want to be completely straight with you. Some of what you're about to hear comes from public record. Interviews, photographs, video footage. But some of it is her interpretation. And that interpretation hasn't necessarily been confirmed by investigators. When you're working with blurry images, similar clothing, people half hidden in the background, identification gets difficult fast. So we're going to examine every claim carefully, without turning speculation into fact. One blurry image doesn't prove anything on its own, but when multiple pieces of footage keep raising the same question, that question is worth sitting with. Point 1. The footage itself. She begins by identifying two people. Jax, Morgan. Points to Morgan's hat as an identifying feature. Points to specific bracelets too. And if those identifications are correct, they immediately create another question. Where exactly were they on the boat? Because newly enhanced footage appears to make certain details easier to see. We can now definitively say, this is Jax, she claims. We can now definitively say this is Morgan. Same hat, same bracelets. So where were they on that boat? Now that the footage is clearer, she notices something else. Nobody in an orange swimsuit. Nobody in a paisley one. But there is somebody, barely visible, wearing red shorts. And she says that same person in red shorts shows up again, in the background of a Snapchat photo connected to Katie. Similar body type, she says, similar hairline, and that same figure was reportedly on the shoreline when a physical altercation broke out. Now here's where we need to draw a hard line, because online, some of this speculation has gone even further, trying to match unidentified people in the footage to named individuals, based on build, posture, even family resemblance. We are not doing that here. A similar hairstyle does not establish someone's identity. And almost everyone discussed in this video has not been charged with anything, has not been named a suspect by investigators. What can actually be said on the record is narrower. Authorities have confirmed they're looking into reports of a physical altercation on the island that day, and whether it involved Nolan. That's real. That's documented. But who specifically was involved is not something a blurry photo can settle, and it's not something we're going to guess at. Point 2. The interviews. There's been a lot of criticism aimed at how people around Nolan have responded publicly since his death, especially the attorney representing some of the young men. The argument goes like this. If the goal is convincing the public the group has nothing to hide, the strongest response would be releasing evidence. Security footage, text messages, communications with Katie, records showing exactly who was where. Instead, the interviews focused heavily on defending reputations, on responding to accusations. One subject came up again and again: race. One of the young men, Jax, argued the group never viewed Nolan differently because he was black, described him as being like a brother to all of them. The commentator pushed back hard on that explanation. Her argument is, simply having a black friend doesn't by itself address broader questions about how race factored into this case. Whether you agree with her or not, that comment became part of a much bigger public debate. Then there's the Coast Guard. One of the friends, Warren, repeatedly emphasized that he contacted them. The commentator challenges both the timing of that call and its significance. She argues the Coast Guard wasn't contacted immediately that evening, that a search of the island didn't happen that night, and she questions why Nolan was still believed to be on the island hours later. If he was expected to return with someone else, shouldn't investigators and the people waiting for him have also considered that something happened after he left the island? That's an interpretation of the timeline. It isn't proof of what happened, but it raises a legitimate question. What did everyone actually believe had happened to Nolan that night? And when did those beliefs change? That takes us back to the island itself. The attorney later returned there, argued that seeing the location firsthand showed how difficult certain theories would actually be. Long, narrow, relatively open, heavily populated on the 4th of July. His argument was, the physical environment made certain scenarios hard to reconcile. But the commentator pushes back on that too. She argues people questioning this case aren't necessarily claiming Nolan was attacked in the middle of thousands of people, in broad daylight. The theory some people have considered is different: an accident, followed by an alleged attempt to conceal what happened. Whether that theory is correct remains unknown. And that matters, because a crowded island doesn't establish what happened to Nolan. But people asking questions doesn't establish a crime either. Those are two very different things. Then the commentator turns to how the young men described their own actions. Warren expressed regret about going out that day, said he thinks about it every single day, but she focuses on the wording. There's a difference, she says, between saying, "I wish we'd never gone out," and saying, "I wish I'd made sure my friend got home safely." Then came another statement. The young men said they believed they'd done everything right, that they'd done nothing wrong. The commentator finds that hard to reconcile with the emotional response she'd expect from someone who just lost a close friend under unexplained circumstances. But here's where we need to be fair. People grieve differently, people behave differently under public pressure, and people speaking through attorneys often choose their words carefully, because they know every single word can be picked apart later. So tone, emotional response, word choice, none of that establishes guilt. Still, the interviews became a major part of the public conversation, and one person in particular stood out to her: Jax. She argues he appeared more controlled, more composed than the others. Focuses on a moment where she believes he looked toward Warren during an answer. She interprets that as significant. She also points out the gathering that night took place at Jax's grandparents' house, and that the group later returned there. Which raises another question. Was there security footage from that house? And if there was, what does it actually show? Because that is exactly the kind of evidence that could move this conversation away from speculation. Who arrived? Who left? What time did they return? Who was with them? And did the footage match what was told to investigators? Those are questions that can actually be answered. Then, another issue involving Katie. According to the commentary, some of the young men initially told deputies they didn't know the girl Nolan left with. Yet communications involving Katie have also been discussed publicly. If investigators can establish different people gave conflicting accounts about whether they knew her, that's something that can be tested. Phone records, messages, interviews, digital evidence. Those records could establish when people actually communicated and what they knew. But even then, a contradiction doesn't automatically explain why someone gave it. That's something investigators would have to determine. Her attention then returns to the attorney. She criticizes his presentation, including what she describes as hand signals, and the way he repeatedly named specific people. 3 names kept appearing: Morgan, Jax, Warren, over and over. He emphasized that those 3 left the island at approximately 4:30, defended them strongly against accusations, and warned anyone making false claims they could face legal consequences. The commentator believes that repeated wording was intentional. She argues he was deliberately separating those 3 from everyone else who'd been present. Why those 3? Why repeatedly name them? Why not everyone who was on those boats? But there's another possible explanation. An attorney usually only speaks for the people he actually represents. The language alone doesn't establish anyone else was involved in wrongdoing. Then came an even stronger statement. He said they didn't know how Nolan Wells died. But he also stated that Morgan, Jax, and Warren had nothing whatsoever to do with Nolan's death. The commentator focuses on what she believes is missing. If the position is that Nolan died accidentally, why not simply say that? Why not say they made mistakes that day, that they wish they'd made different choices, but that Nolan drowned accidentally instead? The emphasis, she argues, remained on denial. And then, there was a moment she considered particularly strange: a laugh. She interprets that laugh as a moment the controlled presentation briefly broke. But that's an interpretation. A laugh doesn't tell us what someone was thinking. A facial expression doesn't establish guilt, and body language can never replace forensic evidence. The bigger criticism, though, is more significant. She believes these interviews are primarily about repairing reputations, not answering the questions surrounding Nolan's disappearance. If the group truly wants to silence the speculation, the strongest response would be evidence. Show the security footage, show the messages, show the communications with Katie, show the records establishing exactly where everyone was. That would answer far more questions than simply saying we're innocent. Which brings us to the biggest question of all: what evidence actually exists? Because while the internet has produced theories about boats, GPS data, photographs, relationships, motives, Nolan's family is still waiting for an official answer about how their son died. Point 3. And this one actually matters most, because while the internet was busy analyzing footage, the internet was also destroying an innocent man's life. His name is Bart Edmiston Jr. His situation is probably the clearest example in this entire case of what happens when speculation outruns evidence. Wave 1 began with a photograph, an old high school photo, Bart with a young woman. People claimed the woman was Katie McCormack, the same Katie who spent time with Nolan on Horn Island. From there, a theory developed, that Bart had a romantic connection to Katie, that this created a possible motive, and that this somehow connected him to what happened to Nolan. But there was a fundamental problem. The woman in the photograph was not Katie McCormack. Bart's attorney, Russell Latino, addressed that publicly. Bart didn't know Katie before her name became publicly associated with this case, and the photograph itself wasn't even recent. The entire foundation of that theory was wrong. But by the time that got clarified, the accusation had already spread everywhere. Bart's family retained an attorney. Cease and desist demands followed. According to his family, one online creator went as far as posting their home, their address, where Bart works, and now they're working with the FBI, with the Mississippi Attorney General's office, on whether cyberstalking laws were broken. That distinction matters. Questioning an investigation is one thing. Publicly accusing a named, private individual of responsibility for a death, based on an unverified photograph, is something very different. And it has real, documented consequences for the people it happens to. Then came Wave 2, this time built around technology, GPS coordinates, waypoints, chart plotters, track logs. A gap appeared in the boat's tracking data. Some people interpreted that gap as evidence that information had deliberately been deleted. From there, the theory escalated into claims about what may have happened between Bart and Nolan, including speculation about who was actually driving Bart's boat that day. But according to Bart's family, he was behind the wheel of his own boat, both to the island and back, not someone else. They say, on the afternoon of the 4th, when a nearby boat began taking on water, he boarded it, helped drain it, briefly towed it, to help the people aboard. None of that comes from investigators. None of it has been independently confirmed. It's Bart's own account, through his attorney. But it's worth stating plainly. Because the theory suggesting someone else may have secretly been driving his boat is a specific, checkable claim, and his side has already put a specific, checkable answer on the record. A gap in GPS data does not automatically mean someone deleted it. Marine tracking equipment can have interruptions for plenty of reasons. Power problems, configuration settings, device limitations. Without a forensic examination establishing deliberate deletion, the gap remains a gap, not proof. There has been no publicly established forensic finding proving Bart was involved in Nolan's death. No agency has named him a suspect. According to his family, Bart voluntarily handed over his boat, his GPS device, his phone, a list of more than 20 potential witnesses, without a warrant, without being asked twice. That doesn't mean every question surrounding the GPS data should be ignored. It means those questions should be answered through evidence, not assumption. Because there's a huge difference between saying this GPS gap needs an explanation and saying this GPS gap proves someone covered up a murder. The first is a question. The second is a conclusion, and Bart's family has said they intend to pursue legal action against creators who cross that line. Now let's talk about the body. Because while the internet was busy analyzing footage and GPS tracks, investigators were dealing with something far more serious. On the morning of July 6th, 2 days after Nolan was last seen, a U.S. park ranger discovered him in the water, near the northwestern shore. His family had spent 2 days hoping he'd be found alive. Instead, they got the news no parent ever wants. But even finding his body didn't answer the central question. How did he die? The initial assessment reportedly found no obvious external signs of pre-death injury. The official autopsy was conducted July 7th by the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office, but the findings were never publicly released. The district attorney explained the results were sealed, would remain confidential until presented to a grand jury. Standard procedure in Jackson County when cause of death hasn't been determined. So publicly, there was still no definitive medical answer. That uncertainty led Nolan's family to commission an independent examination. Forensic pathologist Dr. Roger Mitchell. His report was completed, sent to family attorney Ben Crump on July 19th. 3 days later, on July 22nd, Crump appeared at the NAC National Convention in Chicago, alongside Nolan's parents and Reverend Al Sharpton, and announced the findings. No definitive cause, no definitive manner of death, no skull fractures, no skin lacerations, but one finding immediately attracted attention, a focal area of red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head. That finding was discussed by another forensic expert, the chief medical examiner of Tarrant County, Texas. He explained the discoloration could potentially relate to decomposition of muscle tissue, but it could also potentially represent blunt force injury. The available evidence did not allow for a definitive conclusion, and that distinction is critical. Something that could represent an injury is not the same as proof that an injury occurred. The condition of Nolan's body also limited what the independent exam could determine. Some organs removed during the initial exam were no longer available for Dr. Mitchell to examine. That created unavoidable limitations. Toxicology results weren't publicly available at the time of the announcement either, meaning one of the most important pieces of medical evidence was still outside public view. Meanwhile, additional rewards were announced. Reverend Al Sharpton and Tyler Perry each announced $50,000 for information leading to an arrest and a conviction. But as attention around the case continued to grow, so did misinformation. Mississippi's Public Safety Commissioner warned the public about a toxicology report circulating online that was allegedly fraudulent, urged people to stop sharing it. And this is where the entire case comes back into focus. We now have footage, photographs, GPS records, phone evidence, witness accounts, the distress call recording, 2 medical examinations, countless theories. But none of that has publicly established a definitive cause of death. Nolan's case remains unresolved, and the investigation continues on several fronts at once. The sheriff's office is leading the ground investigation. The district attorney has said, once that investigation is complete, the case will proceed to a grand jury. The DA's office has also appealed directly to anyone who was on the northwestern end of Horn Island on July 4th, who witnessed an argument, a disturbance, anything unusual. Because there were hundreds, potentially thousands of people on that island that day. Someone may have captured a few seconds of video. Someone may have taken a photograph. Someone may have recorded a conversation without realizing its importance. That's why investigators continue working through footage, photographs, digital records, witness accounts. The FBI is also involved on multiple fronts. One concerns cyberstalking and threats connected to online accusations involving people associated with this case. Another involves broader cooperation with state and federal authorities investigating Nolan's death. Social media subpoenas have reportedly been part of the investigation. GPS data is being examined. Audio experts have reportedly analyzed the distress call for additional information, and the grand jury process is moving forward. Crump has also met with the district attorney. The message coming from the official side has remained consistent. This case is not over. A few things have moved recently, and they're worth stating plainly. Family attorneys now say this case could reach a grand jury within about a month. The Congressional Black Caucus has formally asked for federal oversight of the investigation. And several of the young men discussed in this video, along with Bart's family, have reportedly retained lawyers specifically to pursue defamation claims against accounts that named them. That last point isn't a footnote. It's a reason to be careful with every claim in this video, not just the ones about Bart. And one statement from Nolan's friend Javon Williams continues to stand out. Williams was present on Horn Island that day, told CNN he had never known Nolan to stay behind while his friends left. Not once. That doesn't establish what happened. But it is another piece of the timeline investigators have to consider. And maybe that's the most important way to look at this entire case. Not through one photograph, not through one blurry video, not through one facial expression, not through one GPS gap, and not through one person's theory. Instead, look at the entire timeline. Who was there? Which boats were there? Who was driving them? Who was seen on each vessel? Who was on the shoreline? Who was communicating with Katie? What happened around the time Nolan was last seen? What happened during the 90 minutes before the boats left? Why did the distress call happen? Why was it canceled? What do the GPS records actually show? What does Nolan's phone reveal? What does the security footage show? And ultimately, what do the medical findings tell investigators about how Nolan died? Those are questions evidence can actually answer. So, did this TikTok investigator actually find a bombshell, or did she find a pattern of questions nobody's answered yet? Here's the truth. A question is not an accusation. An accusation is not proof. And a theory is not a fact. But unanswered questions still deserve answers, especially when an 18-year-old went to an island on the 4th of July and never came home. Some of the footage we examined today may eventually prove important. Some of these theories may turn out to be wrong, and some of the questions we're asking today may already have answers sitting inside evidence investigators haven't released publicly. That's why we're going to keep following this case, not by treating speculation as fact, not by declaring someone guilty without evidence, but by looking at the verified information and asking the questions that still need answers. If you've been following the Nolan Wells case, let me know in the comments what's the one question you believe investigators need to answer first. And please keep the discussion respectful. There's a real family waiting for answers. And so are several other families whose kids have been named in this case without ever being charged with anything. Nolan was only 18 years old. He went to Horn Island on July 4th. He never came home. There's still a gap in this story, not just in the GPS data, but in what's been shown, what's been said, and what investigators haven't released yet. Until that gap closes, this story isn't finished.